Hey everyone, we're back and ready to begin another module. This module is really focused on a few overarching questions that deal principally with the idea of, that is the concept of government. So we're starting extremely broad here, and we're going to start to hone in on, I think, some really important ideas that are related to modern politics as we go. So let's jump right in. Really the first question that we can contend with in this module is, why government? Well, I think before we answer that question, one thing that we want to do is arrive at least some working definition of government to be able to answer that question. So what we can think about, first of all, is at least one working definition of what a government is. It's an institutional arrangement that perpetuates the concentration of power. Now, there's kind of two words here in this definition that I think themselves deserve some attention. The first one being institution. We saw that in the previous module, and obviously this is something we're going to be talking about a lot in this class because American politics sort of founded on a number of different interlocking institutions. Institutions, ultimately, I think one working definition is they're rules and procedures that provide incentives for political behavior. You might be thinking, oh, an institution's like a big building, or it's the Supreme Court or something. You may be thinking of specific examples, or maybe you can't think of any. This is a really broad definition, in fact. And my take on political institutions are that they are everywhere. Okay, we're going to see that political institutions are easily created. Once they're created, they're things that become incredibly powerful and incredibly sort of difficult to budge politically at the end of the day. But at their most basic level, really what they are, they're just rules. They're rules and procedures. They're ways of doing things that provide incentives for people to engage in behavior, that is to act some way or take some sort of action that is either one way or the other. Right? So institutions encourage you to do one thing and discourage maybe doing another. And so if we think about that from the most basic level, institutions can be extremely powerful. Speaking of power, power is, again, going back to that foundational principle that we talked about, something that goes far back to the 1960s, a guy named E.E. Schattschneider, which is quite a name, who says power is really about who gets what, why, and how. It is the ability to control political outcomes. And so government, ultimately, if we go back to that definition at the top of the slide, it's an institutional arrangement. It's a set of rules and procedures that govern behavior, that perpetuates the concentration of, or essentially, rules over the distribution of who gets what. And so that, I think, is a really useful definition of government. When we think about government and what it is and what it can be and what it's not in this next sort of set of discussions, I think that really the question that we arrive at is one that people have been thinking about since time immemorial, which is why? Right? Why do we have this? And I think one way that we can approach this question is to think about it conceptually. Government is an arena. Okay, it's a combat sort of area, right? It's the gladiatorial pit, where people can go out and do battle. And the thing is that they're not doing actual battle, right? Even though we have some examples in American history of violence, in the Library of Congress and things like that. It's a locus of power. It's a place where we can contest and dispute and sort of have it out with each other without resorting to violence. And so if we think about that as sort of its foundational principle, it's this space where people can engage in peaceful conflict. We might also ask ourselves, well, then how did these things come to be in the first place, right? I think if we think about what they actually do, sort of what the different purported functions of governments are, we can think about some of the reasons why governments may have started to form in many societies across history. So again, as I was just mentioning, government as its most basic sort of foundation, it's a means of organizing conflict. And so, I've attached on Blackboard, for example, a short sort of description in the sort of Stanford Philosophy Encyclopedia of this guy, Thomas Hobbes. You might see on the slide here, you've got Thomas Hobbes and John Calvin drawn in the style of Calvin and Hobbes, who you might be more familiar with. This guy, Thomas Hobbes, who's a political philosopher from a long time ago, essentially said, life in a state of nature, that is, life without government, is nasty, brutish, and short. And of course, it might make sense as to why he was saying that, because his country was enduring a bloody civil war at the time. And he was realizing that, hey, if we don't have some kind of institution where we can come together and, again, duke it out without actually coming to blows, we would probably live a lot longer. We'd probably be a little bit happier. And so over time, many societies came to realize that creating some kind of governmental structure, some sort of institution that governs who gets what, means that we don't constantly fight and we don't constantly go to war with one another. On the flip side of that, right, and again, I'm already starting to get you thinking about this idea that government also is something that can be very large or very small or very, very controlling or very limited, right? Government is also a means of enforcing order. You might see a picture on the slide here that I think is very evocative of this kind of conflict, right? When we say that governments enforce order, we say that they have the sole authority over the use of force. In a state, again, part of that guiding principle of avoiding essentially a state of perpetual civil war. And so really this is, I think, it can't be any more relevant to what's happening today in American politics, where we're having debates about this foundational question, right, about the use of force in a society, about the mistreatment of groups, and about agents who represent the government, right, that is the police, right, engaging in many different kinds of activities across the country, and protest waves, a lot of conflict, right, as a result. And so I think that at the very basic level, when we think back to sort of our political philosophy, right, there's a tension here that always exists about, right, enforcing some kind of order, again, to avoid the Hobbesian state of nature kind of thing. And also, right, this idea that maybe freedoms and liberties are also at stake when we hand essentially authority to a governmental entity. And so, again, I'm not trying to incite a full-scale debate about this particular topic right now, but I think that you can really see the relevance of some of these basic questions in today's political environment. I mean, right, we're already into the 21st century with this, and we've just asked the question, why government, right? So I think this is important. Also, we think about governments as founded originally in an effort to protect people's property. Right? We go back to the American Revolution. We can think very carefully about some of the things that sort of brought Americans to start to assert their freedoms relative to the British control over the colonies. Protecting and enforcing fair and free transactions and accounts, right? We can see here money being printed, currency might be a helpful thing for governments to provide us with so that we have a standard of exchange. And also, the ability to prosecute things like theft, bribery, and, crimes that are of a financial nature, right? So these could also be very useful reasons why government could arise to be able to enforce some of these rules regarding property. The last thing I want to talk about, though, is something that's really important to our course, and something that's I think really gets into some of the foundational debates about how much government, as we've talked about, right? Government is also what we might call a public good provider. And so I think it's very important to think about the definition of what a public good is and isn't. We might say that a public good is a good that may be enjoyed by anyone if it's provided, and may not be denied to anyone once it has been provided. And so I encourage you to pause this slide for a second and ponder that definition, and look at these two sort of pictures here that I have of fireworks and of this really smoggy, terrible air. Let's think maybe carefully on the next slide about how these two images might relate to this definition. So to provide you with another example beyond fireworks, right, which I think fit the bill of something that once provided, what are you going to do? Put blindfolds on people and say, you can't watch these fireworks, get out of here. These fireworks are only for us, right? No, of course. Once they're in the air and they're, bursting over the city in, beautiful, color, there's no way to stop people really from seeing them unless you were to, I don't know, again, put blindfolds on them, which it would be a pretty gross infringement of their rights and liberties, right? An example that I want to talk to you about, though, is a study guide. Let's imagine for a second that all of you wanted to build a study guide for the midterm, and you decided that you could create something in Google Docs and you could pass that along via some sort of public URL. You could email it to the whole class list. And the document begins as this blank slate. And that's the thing about this public good, is that I'm not going to be providing it for you automatically. This is something that you as students can build. And in fact, just to tip my hand a little bit, every time I've taught this class, going all the way back to 2015, I've challenged students and I've said, hey, create one of these things. This could be very useful to you. But it starts out blank. I'm not going to make it for you. And so the question is, right, who wants the study guide? I could imagine all of you right now are probably thinking, yes, I absolutely want this. The question, though, is who's going to make the first entry? Right? Who's going to be the one to take it upon themselves to sort of violate their individual rationality, which is to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs, to actually provide this study guide to others? All right, this is a classic example of a public good. Right? Once it's been provided, anybody can use it, and you really can't. Again, we said that there's this public URL. You could quibble with me about whether or not you could make it a private, a club good and close it off to people. But if we're going by this definition, anyone can use it, and no one can stop other people from using it. But what might happen is we might encounter a situation that's known as free riding, okay, in which some people might say, well, I don't really want to provide an entry in the study guide. What I'll do is I'll go to click on the URL at the end when the midterm comes around, and I'll be able to check out the study guide, and I'll have never had to put in any effort. Great, sweet, right? And so I think that if we were to play this out in real life, which we've done for many, many semesters during our in-class sessions, generally the study guide ends up being not very good, because even though you all have the very best intentions, I know you do, free riding happens. It's just a fact of life, right? It's not saying that anybody's necessarily bad, right? We're just following our rationality principle, and we are prioritizing other things when we get down to it, right? We've got other homework to do. We've got, we're busy, right? We've got jobs, we've got kids, maybe some of us. And so it makes it really hard to prioritize stuff where we receive very little benefit. And so we can think about how we might solve that dilemma, right? How could we actually solve the free rider dilemma? And maybe what are some other examples? I challenge you to pause the slide and just think about maybe some potential solutions to this free rider dilemma. So I hope you paused the slide. I hope you thought a little bit about this. If I were to think about solutions to this free rider dilemma, I would go back to the foundational question that we've been asking in this whole discussion, which is why government, right? And this, I think, is a very, very key insight. What if we were to create some kind of institution, right? A set of rules, in this case, there'd be some kind of formal rules that would incentivize people to change their behavior. That is, to basically force them, right, to contribute to the study guide. If we think about this idea of compelling people to do stuff, that's an institution. And we think about, like, at the most basic level, a lot of the laws that we have in American politics, or in really most politics, right, things like murder is illegal, right? These kinds of laws are institutions that change our behavior because the penalty becomes extremely steep, right? We go to jail for life or whatever, we're prosecuted. If we were to, think about it the other way around as well, we could think about some sort of pro-social kinds of rules and policies, right? I'm reminded of this kind of trash can that exists in Scandinavia, which is like a game. They've gamified the trash can. And so the idea is you've got your garbage, and instead of tossing it on the ground, you can throw it in this garbage can, and it makes lights and sounds, and it's like, good job, hole in one or whatever. It gives you all this positive feedback when you throw in some trash. And what happens is it becomes a fun thing. So people go and look for trash to throw into the trash can so they can get it to react. And so this kind of institution, creating a policy that sets up these trash cans, changes people's behavior and makes them less likely to litter and more likely to throw things away. And so there's government can essentially use incentives, so they can use punishments as institutions to change behavior. But then again, this is where we get into some really difficult territory. Because at the end of the day, that means that people are going to feel like government is telling them what to do. And so one of the foundational questions of politics is, what counts as legitimate use, essentially, of this government power? What can government tell people to do? In what realms should government say, we don't have a role in trying to regulate your behavior? If we think about other kinds of free riding, we can think about innumerable examples. I'm sure you've already thought of some. Where government may have a policy in place, may have created some kind of institution that changes people's behavior to avoid the free riding. Other times, they don't. And as a society, we might say that that's fair, right? So these are where we get into some basic debates about how much government. The last thing I want to talk about is sort of a special kind of good, which is not a public good, but in this case, a common good. Common goods are resources that, unlike the fireworks, which like anyone can see as long as they're sitting and looking at the night sky, these are scarce resources. So you see here, I've got a picture of fish on the slide. Fish are a scarce resource. If we all fish, all the fish, then there will be no more fish, right? QED, right? There's no more fish if we fish all the fish. And unfortunately, because we have a very large global population and we have extremely efficient fishing technologies now, that is a threat. Like we could, if we all did this individually and tried to maximize, using the rationality principle, the amount of fish that we caught, we might end up killing entire fish populations because we have that capacity as humans now. And so that's a tragedy, right? We would be very sad to cause many of the tasty fish that we like to eat to go extinct, right? Or from a basic environmental perspective, we don't want that either. But this is ultimately the tragedy of the common. This is what happens when individual people all try to maximize their utility, all try to get as much benefit and minimize as much cost. So essentially the idea being that if everyone's individually going out there to fish and they're all catching as many fish as they can, we run into a scarcity problem. And so common goods become scarcer when these finite supplies are exhausted. And so again, this is one of the reasons why we might have government try to intervene. So we might have international laws that regulate fishing, where governments across the world agree, okay, we're going to instruct commercial fishermen to only catch this many. And if they reach that limit, we're going to fine them or take away their fishing licenses or impound their boats or whatever if they fish more. Obviously, these aren't perfect. Obviously, overfishing is still a huge problem in the world today. But these kinds of rules can help us regulate these resources. But I think really the overarching takeaway, the big thing that we want to take away from this discussion, is that government, according to some people, might have a role in various areas where they're regulating goods, where they're trying to avoid what they see as tragedies, right? In other cases, there might be a good argument that government doesn't need to play a role, or in fact, government might have unintended negative consequences of coming in and trying to intercede. The fish example is a pretty clear-cut one, right? I think that, given what we know about the science of fisheries, if we don't intervene, then we're not going to have any fish, right? But there's many other realms of politics today where the question arises, right? Where should government step in? Where should they not, right? What's an infringement of rights and liberties? And what is something that's going to result in a tragedy? And so when we think about public goods and common goods, I want you to think about this over the next week, right? Think very carefully about some of these different things and see if you can't apply some of this logic to your daily interactions, your daily thinking about government and what it's telling you can and can't do on a daily basis. And I think that you're going to start to see government in a very different perspective, right? From this foundational theoretical perspective.